Have you ever noticed how the greats in One Piece all seem to smile even in the face of death, like Roger, Odin, and Luffy during Logtown? They all exude that sense of freedom even into their final moments, but one character did the opposite, and that's Mont Blanc Noland. Instead, he showed feelings of hopelessness and despair, quite contrary to what we've seen from other goats in their own executions. But Noland didn't have the luxury of knowing all the truths of the world like Roger and Odin, nor did he die while chasing his dream like Luffy did. At least everyone believed Roger about the One Piece, but nobody believed Noland about the City of Gold. Noland wasn't even a pirate. He was an explorer. He wanted to adventure, discover new plants and medicine, and simply further humanity as a whole. His expression shows just how great he truly was, because despite all of that, he was only worried about his friends. How could an island vanish so suddenly? Was it sheer coincidence that it happened just 1 year before he returned? Well, Noland was about to reveal the Poneglyph with Poseidon's location to Loveneel, and by extension, the world government. That's a blunder almost on the level of whatever Lily did 800 years ago, except this time it would hurt the ancient kingdom. Is it possible that they interfered 400 years ago, almost like they did 200 years ago with their robot that attacked Marijois? Well, there are quite a few things that make Noland seem like yet another Joyboy-esque character born in the wrong place at the wrong time. So I want to talk about what makes this one of Oda's most outstanding characters, and why in a final saga featuring sun gods and poneglyphs, his story will only become more important. People in One Piece head out to sea for as many reasons as there are stars in the sky, but Noland simply wanted to explore and help people, even if it required approval all the way from Marijois. Noland was okay playing by the rules, but the fact that he had rules to follow at all just goes to show how firm the government's grip on control has always been, and also how important Roger starting the Great Age of Pirates was, because thousands of pirates set out to sea looking for his treasure, when 400 years ago it didn't seem nearly as common. Noland had no idea these poneglyphs were out there, or what kind of taboo he was partaking in. He stumbled upon this one completely serendipitously, showing how much of a boss he truly was. But that's just the tip of the iceberg when it comes to why he's worthy of being up there with the other greats in the story. In Noland's introduction, we see that his ship has been sailing for a couple years, and everyone's run out of food. So he just jumps into the ocean and basically takes out a Sea King with his bare hands. Rayleigh did something similar back in the Calm Belt, and neither of them seemed to break a sweat. But my favorite part is the fact that his clothes were folded off to the side. This tiny detail showing Noland's organization or propriety really illustrates what kind of person he is. He's strong as almost anyone, but also intelligent and almost regal. The crew was kind of stunned at what had just happened in front of them, so Noland tells them, "It's our food. You guys are quite worthless. Look at your dumb faces." Basically just roasting all of them for no reason, which could seem pretty rude at first, but it's more of an illustration that Noland is just so far above the common man, and they all know it. His crew loved him through and through throughout the arc. So I look at this more of Noland poking fun at his friends because he's just such an absurd human in general. After that, we see the crew trapped in a dangerous storm where Noland is just calmly writing in his logbook, and his crew told him there's a huge storm outside, and he's just like, "Sure is." Yet again showing that this man is always calm, cool, and collected. The kind of temperament that you usually need to use observation hockey, which is kind of ironic because a second after this, he hears the sound of a bell, one that nobody heard but him. This reminds me of a few different scenes, first being how Roger and Luffy heard the Sea Kings, or how Luffy and Momo heard Zunisha. It's a little different since anyone can hear the bell when you're closer to it, but hearing it from this distance, in the middle of this storm, makes me think it could be a sign of the voice of all things, or at least observation hockey. I mean, Roger did say that poneglyph under the bell had loud voices when he went there with Odin, so maybe that carries into the sound of the bell as well. And that bell was meant to signify "we are here," showing that the island isn't afraid of intruders, but also to draw certain people to the island. Ironically, people like Noland, because he never would have made landfall there if not for the bell. They turned the ship after he heard it, and the crew was thankful after being at sea for so long. When you think about the fact the island needed Noland about as bad as Noland's crew needed the island, it really makes you think if fate had something to do with this. It's not often you have people traveling in the Grand Line in general, let alone botanists like Noland. But writing in his logbook also reminds me of Odin. They were both powerful people who saw the importance of chronicling their adventures. But remember, Odin was also the one who inscribed Roger's message into the gold next to the poneglyph. And while we're on that topic, the fact Odin was even allowed to do that and Roger was even allowed to go see the Poneglyph in the first place tells me that Roger had to be friends with the Skypians and Shandians back in the day. When we saw his flashback, they went up the knock-up stream and were just immediately at the Poneglyph. So it's like Oda is hiding his relationship with the Skypians and Shandians because there's just no way they'd let him go otherwise. They fought to protect that thing for centuries, so there's no way they're gonna let some random dude go there without a fight. And I'm pretty sure this all has something to do with Uranus actually, and I cover that in a lot more detail during this video that you can find down below. And if that's all true, it kinda sets up a paradigm where Roger, Luffy, and Noland all befriended the same people, thus earning the right to see their Poneglyph. They protected that thing for hundreds of years and only few people ever got to see it, so that's an important parallel between the three to begin with. Noland even saved the Tintata just like the Straw Hats did, and Noland lived at the halfway point between the Void Century and current time, really making him like a Joy Boy or Pirate King-esque character. I mean, his hairstyle is literally on the tip of Nika's spear. Noland was like a precursor to the likes of Luffy and Roger, and one who was also too early. So early he didn't even know there was a history or treasure to uncover yet. But honestly, that's probably a good thing for the world government, because this man was capable of almost anything, except for beating me in a game of War Thunder, the sponsor for today's video. War Thunder is the most comprehensive vehicle combat game ever made, with more than 2,000 tanks, planes, helicopters, and of course, ships, all of which are insanely detailed and can be used in PvP battles. And you can play now for free on PC, Xbox Series X and S, PS5, and even the previous console generation. The game offers both quick action-packed matches or more realistic and tactical ones, and the graphics and detail in 4K resolution are just insane. As you could expect, I had to check out the ship options, and while I didn't find Pluton, I did find tons of other battleships that are still great to use. And there's even anime-themed skins for most vehicles in the game, and now there's 3D Dakimakitas which can only be obtained with my link below, and they're available to both PC and console players. This also gives new players a strong boost to start the game, like 7 days of premium account, 100,000 silver lions, and a booster to speed up progress even further. Thanks to War Thunder for sponsoring. Now let's get back to the video. I see Noland as almost a pirate king before there even was a pirate king. Noland could literally move mountains, cure people with the plants around him, and even sail ships basically by himself. When Noland made his second expedition to Jaya, the king demanded Noland take a different crew than his own, and that new crew was literally trash at sailing a ship. They were asking for Noland's help the entire time, and he even noted during a storm how the other ships with them would just need to be sacrificed because he was so focused on ensuring the safety of the king. And I'm sure he would have been in charge of navigating as well. So I really think Noland might have been the most well-rounded adventurer of any sort that we've ever seen in One Piece. And when we talk about Pirate King, we tend to think of the one who finds the One Piece, which is definitely fair since that's literally how you earn the name. But if we were to think of it more like an actual king of the seas, a person who can journey anywhere they want on their own accord, then they need to have an all-around game like Noland. I mean, they need to be strong and have the right kind of will, which I think all of these guys have, but if you want to be the literal king of the seas, then you better be able to sail a boat as well, or create cures when you need it, or find food, or navigate. Roger and Luffy have their own crews to fill in these gaps for them, and you could definitely argue that's what makes them the legitimate Pirate King candidates, but without them around, Luffy would have no chance to sail a ship, navigate, or any of those other things. But Noland could do that all by himself. There is nothing stopping him, and that's what really makes him a Pirate King type character to me, especially back 400 years ago. Noland actually traveled the Grand Line twice before even setting out to Jaya the first time. Roger traveled the Grand Line twice after finding Lodestar the first time, and now that does include the New World as well, but Noland went back and forth into the Grand Line 4 successful times, which is still really impressive. 2 one-month voyages and then 2 long voyages to Shandora. In terms of power scaling, it's pretty difficult to compare Noland to any of the current greats like Roger or Whitebeard, at least from what we've seen from him, but I almost think of it more like Wilt Chamberlain in basketball. These are just completely different eras. Not to mention the fact Noland was shown in the pre-time skip where Haki was not fleshed out whatsoever. I mean, Skypiea is ironically where Haki started to play a major role with Enel's mantra, but still, Noland is just hard to gauge in terms of power. And that's where another important trait comes in that Noland and Luffy share, which is pulling other people to their side. Mihawk made note of how important that was during Marineford, and Noland was able to do the same thing, even with the great warrior Calgara, a warrior who basically never befriended people, let alone laughed or drank with them. And you know, I spoke a lot about Noland's introduction, but I think Calgara's tells us almost just as much about him. He sees a ship approaching the island, so he just swings a giant wrecking ball in order to sink it and take their valuables. This shows us that not only is Calgara obscenely strong, but he stops at nothing to protect his island and the Golden Bell. He was not someone who made friends very often, but he sure did with Noland, which shows how impressive of a leader Noland truly was. And while the lesson during their flashback was pretty clearly to stop believing in these gods so much, I think it's time to revisit that idea since Luffy has been revealed to have the powers of the Sun God, who was name-dropped back in Skypiea. Clearly the Sun God of Shandora was much different than the Rubber Man we know today, but the fact that a Sun God was mentioned here at all is significant, as is the fact we saw Luffy do the Nika pose for the first time here. Oda even said that this panel of everyone celebrating in Skypiea is one of his 3 favorites of all time. So while Noland kind of made it clear that gods don't exist, at least in the way the Shandians thought, it seems like Oda might be pulling us a bit in the other direction with some of the discussion recently about Sun God Nika and even how devil fruits tie to dreams and imagination, as well as the recent reveals of Imu's powers and how the Gorosei are called the warrior gods. I think it's also important that the Shandians are actually from the moon in the first place, which we know thanks to Enel's cover story. They were one of 3 races to come to the Earth in pursuit of resources, along with the Skypians and Birkins. But on that moon was an advanced city with an automata army that was basically just waiting to be powered on by Enel. So even though we see Calgara and the Shandians as kind of tribal or behind the times, they're actually from somewhere that was more advanced than even Noland could probably comprehend. And they were defending a Poneglyph from a kingdom that was probably more advanced than Egghead. The Shandians are a small tribe from the larger group known as Shandorians, who actually fell during the Void Century. Their city of gold prospered more than 1100 years ago, but then fell 800 years ago after fighting some kind of war against the 20 kingdoms. This is a confirmed location that people fought at during the Void Century, which is important in and of itself, and after learning about Lily's blunder that let the Poneglyphs be scattered around the world, I have to wonder how this all ended that left the City of Gold still standing. But the Shandians that we met are descendants of those remaining Shandorians from that time period, and they took it upon themselves to guard Shandora and that Poneglyph. This really puts a lot of things into perspective. In terms of the flashback itself, Noland was clearly in the right by stopping those sacrifices, but in terms of the bigger picture of the story, Noland was also helping out the wrong side of history. While we saw the Shandians as somewhat naive when it came to their rituals, Noland's naivete was almost more dangerous because he trusted his government almost as much as they trusted their gods. Trusting people too much is a similar pitfall that Odin fell into, but almost worse on a grand scale because Noland almost led his king right to Shandora and thus the Poneglyph. That Poneglyph has Poseidon's location on it, and Marijois knew about the expedition. If it wasn't for an apparently lucky stream of water shooting an island to the sky, Noland would have actually ended up making a grave blunder, which is something I'm going to cover much more toward the end of the video, but this still builds an interesting paradigm of who was actually right and wrong there. But regardless, this sequence of events at the sacrificial altar still gives me chills almost every time I read it. I mean, Noland killed what people considered a god right in front of them. Noland rushed in, fought first, and then asked questions later. Quite contrary to the personality that we've seen from him thus far. He's been calm, cool, and collected, whether it was a raging storm or a sea king in the ocean, but when a young girl is being sacrificed, he knew it was time to burst into action. He almost acted more like Calgara did in his introduction, by attacking before asking any questions, but that was because a human life was at risk. It's the same exact vibe that Shanks had in Chapter 1, or that Luffy had in Jaya, which is kind of ironic. Unless someone is actually in danger, there is no need to overreact, which yet again builds this parallel between people like Noland and Luffy. Noland proclaimed that rituals like these are terrible mistakes, where Calgara then rushed in to attack him directly, and Noland says, "That's it? We've barely spoke and now you're gonna kill me?" Which is also a perfect example of the clash of personalities between these two. Yes, it's Oda's version of faith versus science, but also what we usually consider uncivilized versus civilized, or humanity of the past versus humanity humanity of the present. But that's not to paint Calgara in an entirely bad light. He's leading a civilization that has purposefully kept outsiders away for good reason. Their growth as a civilization slowed to a crawl because they were protecting the Poneglyph so much. They've lived this way for hundreds of years, so you can't blame Calgara that much for how he acted. If anything, it's remarkable that he was ever willing to listen to Noland. Even in their first encounter, you could see the seeds of doubt were already growing about the ritual because of his expression and these punctuation marks. Should he trust his god who may not even save them at all, or the man right in front of them that says he can cure it? And not long before this ritual had started, Calgara ran into Seto, who played an important role in this flashback because he was the first one to meet Noland, and also the first one to be cured, which proved Noland knew what he was doing. But when he saw him before Noland's arrival, we got this tragic page where Seto says, "It's you, Calgara. Every time I see you, I wish I was strong like you, and be a courageous warrior defending our land, and not just die like this." Calgara was witnessing a kid who would likely grow to be just like him, facing an early death that he had no way to control. As a leader of the village and the protector, Calgara had to feel somewhat hopeless in that moment. This probably played a big role in why Calgara was questioning his actions against Noland, and why he ever agreed to give him a chance to begin with. Seeing Seto, seeing that his daughter could have been saved from the sacrifice, seeing his village being wiped out right in front of him, which would leave the Poneglyph at risk, that all allowed Calgara to open his mind and even consider Noland as an ally. It's like fate itself created the perfect storm where this could even happen, where Calgara would not only find someone able to cure his village, but also find someone that could somehow become his friend. He even said they've been guarding the island from intruders for hundreds of years, and this was 400 years ago, so only 400 years before the Void Century. So basically what Calgara is saying is, Noland, you're the first person to get this far since we've been guarding the Poneglyph, which is impressive for both of them in different ways, but also just goes to show again how fate almost built the perfect storm to even allow this to happen. But none of that would excuse a sacrifice like this. Noland even took an attack on purpose to protect Calgara's own daughter, which just had to have some kind of mental effect on him. And the best part of this whole thing, in my opinion, happens right afterward, where he says it's a shame that such ideals still exist in this time and age, and even that events like these were demeaning to herbalists like him. Yet again, just echoing the idea that this is truly the ultimate showing of faith versus science, but also Noland's unwavering goal of pushing humanity forward, or evolving in a way. Noland was enraged that there are humans out there still living like this at all. He was probably wondering, are there other islands doing the same thing? How has nobody checked up on these people until he did? Who taught them these absurd rituals in the first place? Noland had gone on 2 expeditions prior to this one and probably encountered nothing like this. He was finding out the world was not quite as he believed at all. And while his attitude here is obviously coming from a good place, it's all very ironic given what I said earlier about Calgara doing all of this to protect the Poneglyph. This wasn't a tribal island that did all of this willy-nilly. They were protecting a key piece of history, one they had fought an entire war over before. And that Poneglyph contains the location of Poseidon. If the government was able to hide that information, or even decode it and act on it somehow, the world would probably be cooked. It's ironic that Noland, someone who the government allowed to go on these expeditions, actually helped protect the Poneglyph by saving those people. But that was only possible because after Noland's impassioned speech that I mentioned earlier, the elder of the village gives him a chance to cure everyone. Pretty sure this guy's a descendant of the Shandia chief of the current time, who looks a lot like Garp. I mean, they even have similar headdresses to Garp, with the current one even having a dog, which is Garp's thing, so not sure what Oda's cooking up with that, but the connection's pretty undeniable. But after locking up Noland's crew, the elder gives what is truly one of my favorite quotes in the whole story, where he says, "We can no longer hear the voices of our God, but I'm trying to hear the voices of men." Do you listen to the deities that you can't even guarantee will help you in the first place? Or do you trust the man right in front of you who says he knows that he can? It's an easy question for us when we're reading the story, but for a society who has lived a certain way for this long, it's not quite that easy. And then what Oda does next is truly masterful writing to me, because Calgara gets an instant payoff for his decision making. Seto is sitting outside waiting for this meeting to end and immediately tells Calgara that he's been cured. Noland actually knew what he was doing. Calgara gets confirmation that this isn't all some kind of sham, and sure enough, we get to see Noland finding the Coaline right after this, so the whole island can be saved as well. This is beautiful because when Noland's crew was captured earlier, they had no concern that their captain, or admiral as they call him, would come back with the cure, even though they didn't know for sure if Coaline existed on the island. All they had so far was the stuff they brought with them, but they still had blind trust in their admiral. It's the same kind of trust that the Straw Hats have in Luffy. Noland always comes through just like many of the other goats in the story. However, as fate would have it, Noland somehow got sandwiched between two pieces of the island. I mean, how is that even possible? Calgara showed up trying to talk some stuff, and Noland just told him that was God? Well, that wasn't so powerful if it was only able to take down one man, and then he even moved the pieces of land a little bit. And then the snake shows up, the child of the Kashi from before, and also the parent of Nola, who we met in Skypiea. Pretty sure these snakes are somehow connected to Uranus and Roger's egg, meaning they are kind of gods in a way, but again, just check the Uranus video for more info on that. But then we get another legendary speech from Noland, basically saying that he has what he needs to make the vaccine, and how Calgara has no idea how many people have died to ensure its birth, and that their rituals are an insult to mankind. This reminds Calgara of what the Elder had to say just a few chapters ago, so he decides to kill the snake, listening to the man in front of him and asking Noland to save the village. And before you know it, we're back in the village with everyone being treated, the crew laughing, and Calgara crying that his daughter is okay. Confirmation that he had these pent-up feelings this entire time. Calgara wasn't truly some savage who sacrificed people just because he wanted, but he was trying to be a leader and do what he needed for his village, even if that meant giving up his daughter. Now, I think this entire flashback up to this point can be a really good parallel to the fall of the Aztec Empire, because while I'm no history buff, my brief research says that they lost to the Spanish thanks, at least in large part, to smallpox spreading throughout their people. With it being much harder to combat the Spanish at that point, they fell in late 1521. That's interesting for a few reasons. I mean, obviously the smallpox is a parallel to the tree rush fever, but the fact they lost to the Spanish is interesting because several celestial dragons have Spanish surnames, like Don Quixote or Garcia. Also, the Aztecs fell in late 1521, and the year right now in One Piece is somewhere extremely close to that. Noland mentioned that he arrived to Shandora on May 12th, 1122, and that was said to be around 400 years ago. Add on 2 years for the time skip, and that would be around 1524 today. The fact it's close at all is crazy, I think. The Aztecs also worshipped a god called Quetzalcoatl, which I think is almost too fitting to the giant snake thing that they had worshipped. Uranus is the god of the sky, and their civilization ended up being in the sky, so there's definitely something there. After saving Shandia, Calgara shows Noland the City of Gold, and it's a perfect kind of juxtaposition here where, while Calgara just learned why Noland was so serious about killing their god, since the cure actually worked, Noland now realizes what Calgara was so serious about when protecting the island all these years. He finally gets to see the golden bell that brought him to the island originally, and Calgara tells him that its purpose is to guide their ancestors back to the island after death, and proclaim, "We are here." Now, we realize later that their sacred trees were supposed to house these spirits, but after all we've heard about inherited will and such in the story, I think the bell worked in a much more literal way, where Noland is the exact type of person the island is trying to bring back, or people like Luffy, and probably Roger, who, again, almost has a 100% chance of helping out the Skypians at some point, or else he would have never even gotten to see that Poneglyph so easily, but Oda just hasn't told us all that yet. The bell brought back people who needed to be there to continue the light of Shandora, and ironically, both Noland and Luffy defeated a god in order to save the people, and Roger may have taken an egg with the name of a god being Uranus at some point in the past. And I also think the designs on the bell are worth looking into too. One of the most important obviously being the monkey with the straw hat up there. I mean, there's absolutely no way that's not going to be important somehow, and it probably has something to do with the chief that looks a lot like Garp. Maybe the monkey family used to be rulers of some kind, but also at the top of the bell, I'm pretty sure that's a chestnut, or a Mont Blanc at least. A Mont Blanc is basically a chestnut dessert that is identical to his hair, even down to the colors, so I think that design being on the bell is pretty significant. But either way, it could be a coincidence, but I honestly just doubt it. But then there's also also what looks like a snake or eel of some kind on the bell as well, which probably ties into what they called God. And this bell went on to mean so much to the story because hitting it was one of Luffy's goals. He wanted to hit it and let everyone know the city was actually up there, to help avenge Cricket's family name and prove their trust in Noland was worth it. And Oda did such an amazing job having that action coincide with defeating Enel, where in one fell swoop, Luffy defeated this so-called god and also rang the bell that has probably been silent for hundreds of years. The entire Noland flashback was given from the perspective of Wiper. It started because he flashed back to the chief of his village talking about Calgara's friend, Noland. And Wiper as a child ended up asking him, "When I grow up, I'll ring the bell. If I do it, Noland will hear it, right?" And the chief starts crying and he says, "Yes, of course, because we're so high above ground and so close to heaven, aren't we?" It's just insanely beautiful writing on Oda's part to tie these stories together 400 years apart like this. Going back to the flashback, we then see Noland and Calgara just having a grand time together. First, Noland introduces them to pumpkins, which actually ended up becoming a sacred vegetable of Skypiea. We saw Gonfall, the previous god of Skypiea, had a whole garden of them. And even amidst Luffy dispelling the Raigo when everything seemed hopeless, we got a quick flashback to him watering that garden. Verth was important to them because they couldn't grow new crops without it, and Noland's adventures throughout the Blue Sea led to a god growing the crops that he introduced, which is just such a cool world building thing, I think. And there were also these trees in Upper Yard that looked kind of like Noland's pants. We don't have actual evidence that he introduced these, but they look pretty out of place in my opinion, so I bet they are his if I had to guess. And a lot of this gets more interesting when you consider what we just learned in chapter 1086. Here we finally got the Gorosei's names, and one of them was Saint Marcus Mars, the environmental warrior god. For years, people have mentioned how closely he resembles Gonfall, and now we see his role somewhat covers the environment, which Gonfall had respected and admired for years as Verth. He even called Verth admiration itself. The Skypians didn't have an environment in the same way that people are used to on the Blue Sea until Shandia flew up there. And that's really interesting when you consider Enel's cover story, where the Shandorians, Skypians, and Birkins went to the Earth because they ran out of resources on the moon. It's like the sky races have constantly held the environment, or the Verth itself, in extremely high regard, and that could tie to Mars's role in the Gorosei. And then later we see Noland and Calgara have a party that is almost identical to the one we saw the Straw Hats have after Skypiea, complete with the square bonfire and everything. Yet again, truly building this parallel between Noland and Luffy from beginning to end. But all of a sudden, the Shandians no longer wanted to do anything with Noland. They began patiently awaiting his departure, all because he chopped down their sacred trees. You would think that after all he did proving that their gods aren't real and how trustworthy he was, they would give him a longer leash, but no. Ancestors are something you just don't mess with. And even Noland recognized that completely after he found out what happened. It truly was just an extremely unfortunate misunderstanding, because Noland was only trying to protect them, as he always had done. Those trees were gonna keep making everyone sick, so they had to get rid of them. But he should have asked first. A lot of people will do something and apologize later, which I've definitely done a few times before, so maybe it's okay here and there, but times like this are not those times. Calgara asked him, "Are these sacrifices for your science?" Which is such a cold line in hindsight. We do have a lot of questionable experimentation in our world that, while ethically challenging to say the least, does lead to a lot of medicine that helps us out in major ways and saves a lot of lives. And as I've said many times, this entire thing is about the different sides of faith versus science. And this is one of the valid criticisms of new science, quote unquote. And seeing that come in a physical or palatable way from Calgara and these trees really makes that hit home. But we have to ask ourselves, what is the truth behind these trees? It seems almost a little far-fetched that souls would ever reside within these trees, because I mean, shouldn't they be in the underworld or heaven or something? And why would the bell be able to bring them back specifically? Well, I wonder if it actually has something to do with the 21 grams of soul that leave your body after you die. This was mentioned in Egghead from some experiments from a doctor in the West Blue, who was probably hogback, unfortunately I guess, and it references real-life experiments to find the soul. However, in One Piece, this is definitely an actual thing because of Brook. When Brook died, his soul was shown as almost like a little cloud that came from the sky searching for his body. It had a physical form of sorts, and we can even see Brook go into a soul form now if he so chooses. And Vegapunk was able to recreate devil fruit powers, so it kinda begs the question if that fruit has anything to do with those trees. Or at the bare minimum, it just proves that souls coming back to this world is possible. And the Ancient Kingdom was probably more advanced than Vegapunk, and the Ancient Kingdom seems to have some kind of tie to Shandora, or maybe a past user of Brook's fruit just awakened on that island or something. It is interesting that a bell is what brings them back, and obviously Brook is a musician who does a lot of soul stuff with his music, so maybe there's some connection there again between music and souls. And if souls actually were in those trees, then Noland cutting them down could seem like a bad thing, because now those souls have to probably head back to the underworld, but maybe it was also a good thing. Because if the trees were sick, the souls inside were probably not feeling all that good either. And I'm sure the ancestors wouldn't want the people of today to get sick just to stick around inside these trees or whatever. Noland was already doing the right thing because the trees were infected, but if their ancestors were actually in those trees and suffering from the disease as well, then it's kind of a double whammy where the Shandians really messed up their view on this guy because he did what their ancestors wanted. He may have basically put them out of their misery in a way. And because of Noland's immense regret over this situation, he also left all of the gold on the beach at Jaya. It's a noble gesture for sure, but what's really impactful about this is that if he had brought some of that gold back with him, then his government would have probably believed him about the City of Gold. He would have had irrefutable proof that it exists. Instead, all they had to go off of was his and his crew's word. But if he had actual gold to prove it, then he may not have died the way he did. His death was a complete and utter result of his selflessness and morality, as was his sad expression at his execution. And knowing that he was executed that way makes this send-off from Jaya hit so much harder, where Calgara runs out to the sea and proclaims, "The bell will always ring for you. Until you come back, then we'll meet again and rejoin as friends," where Noland then responds, "We'll meet again, I promise." This is why Noland could not smile at his execution, but I would argue that promise was actually fulfilled, because inherited will is one of the most important themes in One Piece, and the moment Wiper learned Luffy's goal was to ring the bell and clear Noland's name, that promise was kept. Wiper, carrying Calgara's will, finally recognized that Luffy was carrying Noland's, meaning these friends did meet again. But then we get to the execution, where Noland is almost in a one-to-one situation to Roger in Logtown. But the inversion between them goes even deeper than just their smiles or lack thereof, because Roger told everyone that the One Piece was out there, and everyone believed him. But Noland claimed Shandora was real, and nobody believed him. In fact, people often doubted a lot of his tales. Roger had the luxury of knowing the truth of the world about the Void Century, the ancient weapons, and everything in between, but Noland knew nothing compared to that. He probably didn't know much about the government's evil past or the treasures that could lie in wait out there for him. He was playing by the rules and still getting cooked, while Roger did the exact opposite and didn't get taken out until he turned himself in. It's almost like a full inversion on what happens when you play by the rules and listen to the government, or what happens when you chase your dream and head out to the sea. But the worst part is when King Aruyuteyan V pretends that this scrub sailed with Noland just so he can get the crowd on his side by claiming every word was a lie all along. This is like Noland's version of the fake Straw Hats or something, and when his actual crew tried stepping in, the king had them taken away. They didn't even know what had happened yet on the journey because they were asking Noland if he reunited with Calgara or not. The fact the king made Noland take a new crew on this expedition and also lied about this rando being on his crew for the first one is like a Spandam or a Orochi level of nastiness. But this entire time, all Noland was worried about was his friends, and not himself. He didn't get the same level of closure that Roger and Odin got from knowing the true history, or at least the satisfaction of dying while pursuing your dream like Luffy did. He didn't even get to have the knowledge that his crew or greatest friend Calgara would be okay. Roger turned himself in and his whole crew lived on. Odin set his scabbards free after the boiling right before he died, and Luffy didn't have a reason to think anyone but himself was gonna die in Logtown. So when we compare all those who smile in the face of death, I think it's fair to look at Noland's quite a bit differently. But then we also have to go check in on Calgara, who ironically was met with someone immediately calling themselves God. Again, such beautiful writing from Oda, because thanks to what Calgara learned from Noland, he knew that was some bullshit. Other people's gods are only gods because they call them that. They aren't any more powerful than another man or a snake. However, this would also prove to be the end for Calgara, who ended up dying sometime during this war, thus starting another long period of conflict for this land of Shandora. But is it sheer coincidence that this all happened just 1 year before they would have been discovered by Loveneel and the world government? Islands don't go to the sky very often, if ever, so it almost seems more likely that someone was pulling the strings. So I want to shout out this video from Parvision where he talks about this in depth, and while he brings up a lot of valid points, I come to basically the opposite conclusion. Marijwa waited 5 whole years to approve the mission, and the king wouldn't even let Noland take his own crew. And since they branded Noland a liar as an example afterward to keep people from ever searching for the City of Gold, it almost seems like the government set him up. They either caused the knock-up stream, which would be kind of wild, or they at least waited until it happened to let him go back. The government seems like the likely culprit here given the amount of information, but there are a few important details that make me think it was actually the Ancient Kingdom's doing. The first is the simple fact that the government should have wanted that Poneglyph. Having the Poneglyph with the location of Poseidon locked away in their possession has to be worth more than branding Noland to be a liar. Those books may have deterred people from looking for it, but owning the Poneglyph directly would keep anyone from ever being able to find it without going through the government directly. Why they waited 5 years is still somewhat of a mystery, but I doubt it would be to purposefully miss their chance at getting a Poneglyph. The next important thing to consider is that there were earthquakes on Jaya before Noland even got there, and that's how he almost died in the first place. The Shandians mentioned how that must be the 5th earthquake in a week, and Calgara noticed how the island is breaking into pieces already. I suspect these earthquakes have something to do with the knock-up stream underneath it. The main theory on how knock-up streams work, which it was said to not be confirmed, but still, is basically that geothermal heat heats up the cold water in a large cave under the ocean, which builds up enough pressure over time to create a knock-up stream. Since it was said to not be confirmed, part of me hopes it's just a giant whale shooting water out of their blowhole, but that's beside the point. I think the reason earthquakes were happening at all was because the knock-up stream was activating or trying to activate or whatever under the island, kind of nudging it loose over time. So why did that happen at that specific time instead of any other point in their history? Well, it could be an all-natural coincidence, but that would be one hell of a coincidence. So I think it was probably set up a long time ago by the high-tech Ancient Kingdom. Remember how the ancient robot in Egghead was said to have attacked Marijwa 200 years ago? Well, that occurred at the same time the fishmen were joining the reverie. From what we can tell, they didn't get a chance to go back until the last one, where we saw Poseidon almost get captured twice. The Red Line is the worst place for Poseidon to be because she can't call on the Sea Kings, nor could they get up there and do anything even if they did hear her. I think the reason the robot ever attacked Marijwa was for something similar. If the fishmen had joined the reverie 200 years ago, the fishmen would be allied with the world government right now, meaning Poseidon would be on the wrong side and the only entrance to the new world would be kind of compromised. That robot seemed to have played a role in the fishmen not rejoining until recently. And since Shandora had Poseidon's Poneglyph, I think the Ancient Kingdom put in some serious effort to protect that one as well. When Roger and Odin went to Laughtale, they seemed to even learn things about the future, like Roger saying he was too early, and Odin telling Toki to just jump forward 20 years. The Ancient Kingdom seemed to have a good grasp on how these next 800 years would go, so they probably put some things in place to move the island at the perfect time. Because while the Noland the Liar books appear to be a good thing for the world government, they actually benefit the Ancient Kingdom, I think. Think about how many pirates were in and around Jaya during Luffy's time. I mean, that's even when we met Blackbeard, and if the City of Gold was still there, it would have undoubtedly been subjugated a long time ago. I mean, the Shandians are strong, but I don't know if they're that strong. The Grand Line became quite a risk in the back half of those 800 years, so those books deterred anyone without the proper will from searching for it. Only people with Luffy or Roger's temperament would even believe the story and try to go up there. I mean, the bell even went all the way on top of the beanstalk, where even the Shandians and Enel weren't sure where to find it until later on in the arc. But Roger could hear it because of its loud voice. It's like fate all too perfectly hid that bell and Poneglyph so only the right people would find it. This makes Noland's death partially the Ancient Kingdom's doing. If Lily's blunder was the worst case scenario for the world government because the Poneglyphs were spread throughout the world, then Noland was about to do something just as bad for the Ancient Kingdom, if not worse. He was basically a necessary sacrifice in the larger scheme of things, and what makes his death so tragic is he didn't have the same answers as anyone else, like Roger and Odin. But lastly, I want to talk about Noland's all too obvious ties to Usopp. Partially because it's one of the most exciting parts for me, but also because a lot of this involves the other bit of history that we know about Noland, which is with the Tentata. He actually saved them before he ever went to Shandora, which builds that connection to Luffy and Joyboy even more because the Tentata were saved 3 times. 800 years ago after the Void Century by King Riku, 400 years ago by Noland, and then recently by Luffy, Usopp, and the other Straw Hats. They're also one of the only groups with information from before the Void Century, so I'm surprised Noland didn't pick up on that and figure out that his country might be kind of scummy for working with them anyway, but I digress. The most obvious connections between Usopp and Noland are that they are both quote-unquote liars, they are both botanists, and they both helped save the Tentata pretty directly. Usopp even lied that he was related to Noland, which basically guarantees that it's the truth since everything he lies about comes true, which is really such a beautiful inversion with Noland, where Noland actually traveled the seas, saved people, battled giant creatures, and everything else. Nobody believes what he had to say, despite it being the truth. Usopp says those same exact things, but then they come true after the fact. Noland is basically the brave warrior that Usopp wants to be, but he just isn't remembered as such. It's all about how you're depicted and remembered. And this is a really good time to mention another amazing video from my friend Hidden Island. I mean, just a glimpse at the thumbnail probably gives you an idea of where he's going with it, and it's pretty much headcanon for me, so definitely go check that out. It's just a phenomenal listen. But what really kills me about these two characters is that Usopp is now known as God Usopp, and Noland risked his life to prove to Calgara that his god wasn't real. False gods are clearly not Noland's thing, but here's Usopp carrying that moniker. Noland did everything right except the side he was on, and he got absolutely zero glory, while Usopp is getting an absurd amount of glory for doing a fraction of the work. Even when Noland was spending time in Loveneel after his trip to Shandora, he was telling stories about the dwarves, which the narrator mentioned back then that nobody was sure if Noland was serious. He was such a boss that even his real stories were hard to believe. Usopp, on the other hand, told the same story about the dwarves, which at the time was a big fat lie, but then it actually ended up being true. Noland said the truth, but it gets viewed as a lie. Usopp tells a lie, and after a while, it gets viewed as the truth. But I think their connection to botany is the most important thing, actually. Usopp's entire 2-year time skip was spent with Heracles so that he could master the pop greens, and Noland ventured island to island specifically looking for new plants and cures. He called himself an herbalist. Can you imagine if Noland ever got to the Bowen Archipelago and learned how to use pop greens? He would be even more unstoppable than he already was. But more importantly, the Tentata were used to grow smile fruits for Doflamingo on the farm, and both Usopp and Noland had a hand in helping them at least at some point in time. So it makes me wonder if Usopp will ever be involved in finding out the truth of devil fruits in the first place. He's kind of carrying the torch in terms of Noland's botany, and the Tentata were even enslaved by the Don Quixote before the Void Century. They are called devil fruits, and Usopp is a god who is a botanist, which is kind of weird to say out loud, but you know what I mean. He's kind of like a perfect fit in that regard. And look, if you're still here, I want to give you a huge thank you. Noland is one of my favorite characters in the story, and I've been plotting this video for a minute now, so I really appreciate you sticking through it. And if you want to support the channel even further, please remember to check out War Thunder for free on PC, PlayStation, and Xbox, and use my link below to get a 3D Dakimakita pillow available to both PC and console players. And new players can also get 7 days of premium account, 100,000 Silver Lions, and a booster to speed up progress even further. That's it for this video, guys. Please remember to hit like and subscribe and all those YouTube things, but until next time, later.